Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Practically Platonic. Hi, Sylvia.
Hey there.
So, in this episode, we're going to look at three parts: 2.6 on substance and quality, 2.7 on complete blending, and 2.8 on seeing, or how it is that distant things appear small. So, as the translator's preface introduction explains, 2.6 on substance and on quality is rather terse, and it's subject to a lot of interpretations. So one of the key sentences that I drew from this was Plotinus saying, in fact, this holds in the intelligible world because there are all things are one, but in the sensible world, the images have been separated from one another, and the one is distinct from the other. So we find a rather nuanced interpretation of two concepts in this section, substance and quality, and a lot of this discussion relates to the intelligible realm. So basically, substance is the essential nature of something. So it possesses an underlying reality that persists through various modifications or evolutions or changes. So each form in the intelligible realm has its own unique substance, and it's complete and perfect. And so by virtue of that, a substance is indivisible and unified. Whereas qualities are not unique or independent entities, but instead they are sort of determinations or expressions of the substance that underlies them. So the underlying substrate is the substance, and then the qualities are expressions of that. Their specific features or characteristics differentiate one form from another. So whereas the substance is ultimately singular, the form, a form, can have many qualities. Qualities are not independent of the substance, but they're inherently dependent on it. So for Plotinus, the substance is a sort of ontological primacy, whereas qualities are epiphenomena in my reading of this. And then we also have to look at how this is understood at the material world. So the material world, of course, reflects and participates and receives the forms, but with many imperfections and limitations. And so matter itself, lacking any sort of intrinsic form or intelligibility, has to act as a receptacle for forms, but they manifest in a limited way. And so these different kinds of matter that we perceive have different, capacities to receive and express the forms. And then these are differentiated in the material world using our normal sensory apparatus. And it's at this ordinary level that we normally characterize things and we perceive various qualities. So having summarized substance and quality, we're presented with a number of challenges because we have to, first of all, properly understand what substance is, and then also how are the qualities derived from that. So what do you think about this, Sylvia?
I think that it's a good opportunity for us to more than come to many conclusions about the overarching concept of this chapter, to maybe pull apart the different concepts and try to explain to each other and to whomever may be listening some of the difficult parts of this. As the intro already stated, this is quite difficult, and it seems that at a different point in time, Plotinus went back and elaborated and refined the concepts he was trying to state here. I don't think he fully succeeded. I think it could be a matter of, over the centuries and decades, incorrect transcription. It could be bad translation. It could be bad note taking from his students. I don't know, but there's some things that I find quite inconsistent. So I would like to first off just kind of start going step by step and trying to define these different terms and how they relate to each other. So you first stated, and I think you pretty much explained overall what substance is. And in the chapter he says, but you also mentioned form. So my first question to you is, are substance and form identical, or are they two different things, in your opinion or in your reading of this?
So substance seems to be a feature of the forms rather than being a separate entity or a separate thing from the forms. So substance is effectively the
Okay.
intelligibles. It is the forms, but that's the sort of underlying foundation from which qualities are expressed.
So you think that substances are second categorically to the forms? They are aspects of the forms?
There is a maybe ontological function here. So maybe we could qualify it as a function of the forms rather than being a secondary aspect of the
Mm,
forms.
okay, see. Do you have any insight into what this function is? And if you don't, that's totally fine because I'm already at this point. I guess if we move forward, it might clarify, but at this point, it's still unclear to me what it is. He says it's any intellect or any distinct being in the intelligible world is substance. That's, or at least that's platonically how it's defined. But then I find that confusing because, at least in this edition, it defines it as any distinct being, but it also says that substance is a totality of 5 genera, of which being is one of them. So it's unclear to me how it can be both being and being be one of its subcomponents. And these 5 genera are that he mentions are motion, stability, identity, difference, and being, which I think we could also get into what does this mean? What are the genera? What are these things mean? But let's try to stick to what exactly is substance and how does it interrelate with, at this point, the term form, quality, and being.
So each form has its own unique substance. And I think this is an attempt to explain how you get an expression of that. So this is, again, an attempt to explain how we get from the forms in the intelligible realm to expressions at the level of the senses, like sensible.
Okay, so it's like kind of him trying to explain how things emanate from the intelligible realm into the material realm.
Right. And how do we qualify, understand, perceive the forms? And so it's through reference to the qualities that we, characterize the forms. And so this is effectively a sort of functional ontology, rather than attempting to create new ontological categories that would somehow be separate from or building upon the form. So it's not that you have the forms and then you have substances on top of that, but rather it's explaining a function of
I see.
forms. Right.
So the substance is just a function, even though it's still not clear to me what function this is.
Right. Yeah. It is. It is a very challenging concept. So the substances.
If it's unclear to you, you can just tell us. But I'm just, because I'm trying to understand between the two of us if there's something I'm missing or if you're having the same issues understanding what exactly these things are in relation to everything else he proceeds to correlate them with or relate them to.
I think I have a basic understanding of what he's saying, but again,
Okay.
I'm very challenged by this content as well.
Okay. So let's try looking at qualities now. You've mentioned them a few times, but can we have, let's see, he says in the book that they're completely external to the substances, so they're independent of the substances, but they're also, as you were saying earlier to me, they're also only existent in relation to the substances, and they give it some extra aspect. They give like qualities, and I guess in a more mundane sense of the term, to the substance, but they're
Right.
independent of it in the sense that they're variable. I guess, but
Right.
they are necessary. correct? Like, that was like my main question. The concept of like whether things are accidental or necessary to the identity of a thing. Are the qualities of a substance accidental or necessary for it to be that thing? He does start kind of giving examples like with whiteness of a swan, but it is unclear to me if he's saying that that is a quality and if that quality is accidental or necessary for it to be a swan. Or if he's saying that that's a quality at all, if it's something else.
Well, it's definitely mutable because you can have swans that are not white.
So I guess, would he say that it's not an actual quality, or is he saying it is a quality and qualities are not necessary?
Well, qualities are inevitable expressions of the forms. So each form can possess many qualities, and these qualities have to arise out of the sort of complexity of the form's substance. Now, I would say that the qualities don't exist independent of the substance because they're effectively dependent on it. Because
So would an example? Go ahead.
Right. So if they were independent of substance, then they could exist without reference to the forms.
So would an example be the form? And I may be wrong. I'm just trying to understand how this breaks down. If the form or the substance of human being is what we're talking about, if that's even a valid example, would the qualities be things such as male and female? Or would it be something more like, because it can be one could be male or female, or rather, let's just take one example. Or I guess you could say, are the two genders in and of themselves necessary qualities to being human? And if they are, or are they necessary aspects? Let's use that term. And if they are, does that make them qualities or not? Or would a quality be like the form of human, but having brown hair? Is the brown hair a quality? Because you could very well have blonde hair or no hair and you would still be a human.
I think in this case, again, we have to kind of look at it from a functional point of view, because the qualities, this concept of qualities is attempting to explain how forms are differentiated from one another. So there is a form, for example, of brown hair. There is a form of black hair, for example. But then there has to be some sort of perception of that at the sensible level. And so when you see hair, you are also identifying a color code with it as well. And that would be, at the mundane level, one of the qualities of the hair would be the coloration of it.
So in the intelligible realm, the two things aren't really separate. There's the form of one type of hair or the other type of hair. But in this, when emanated to the material world, the color per se kind of becomes a quality of it.
Yes.
Or is perceived as such.
At the sensible level, but at the level of the intelligible realm, this distinction between the substance and the quality isn't really so absolute, because this is unlike in the material world. So the qualities in the intelligible realm, if you were to make very strong distinctions between them, then you would sort of undermine this idea of the perfection of the forms, that they're complete in their totality and fully actualized. But rather the qualities at the intelligible realm would reflect or represent the abundant richness and diversity of the forms, but there is a sort of differentiation between them at the same time. And maybe this goes back to an earlier section where Plotinus is talking about intelligible matter and sensible matter. So intelligible matter is basically differentiation of the forms, and the expression of that becomes matter at the level of the sensible world.
I was thinking of that, and I wonder, and we'll see, I guess, when we get to the other section that the editors noted, but I'm kind of wondering if he like did a little bit of overkill, at least with this chapter. Like, where is he getting these ideas from? He hasn't really explained how he came to these conclusions, and it seems like he's trying to present things which are not explained very clearly, which seem to me to not be helping his argument of the simplicity and oneness of the forms. It seems like I don't know. I can't really make a true judgment on this. It's just my perception at this point in time. But I just find this whole chapter both frustrating but also dubious. I don't feel like he's doing his argument any favor, and he's not really explaining where this is coming from. But of course, we're not reading this in the order in which it was written or in the order in which he gave his lectures. Which brings me, I guess, to another question I had. So the 5 genera, are those qualities in the intelligible realm, or not, or are they seem like they kind of make sense to me, but he doesn't really come back to them to much degree in this chapter. Motion, stability, identity, difference, being. I understand as he's already presented kind of the idea of difference, how things differentiate. And I assume, I mean, I understand what identity means. I just don't understand how these are subsets of substance, which is what he says they are. Instability and motion.
So he's attempting to grapple, I think, with the fact that the forms have to be singular and unified and perfected and actualized.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has to come up with this new framework to explain how the whole process of differentiation unfolds, and also how we would characterize them and qualify them. And this is not very well explained in this particular treatise, I agree.
I was listening to a really fringe podcast the other day where they were talking about the projection of atoms into a quantum, like almost like a holographic realm of. Have you heard about this?
No.
It kind of made me think. I don't know how much validity it has, but it's some fringe research that this Russian scientist was doing, who was nominated for the Nobel Prize. I believe he won it, or maybe he was just nominated. And shortly after, like just a couple of weeks after his nomination or winning, he died under suspicious circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, some of the stuff they were talking about, it kind of reminds me of what I think Plotinus is trying to do here, to explain how the forms and the different ways that the forms can project into the material world or emanate into the material world, how that may be happening. Mm-hmm. It was definitely like an out there concept of that, which I'm going to have to look into, and if I find any more information on it, come back to you guys with. But maybe there's something to it. It seems like he's trying to explain how these things project into this reality, and maybe there is something to it. I just don't know how in his time, he clearly wasn't using anything empirical to come to these conclusions. This is all, I guess, some sort of logical deduction he was coming to, but I'm a little frustrated that he doesn't give any explanation to how he comes to these concepts. Again, he may be discussing this in other sections of the book or sections that are lost to us.
We can imagine that when he was speaking to his students, there was, a question and answer. There was prep material. Maybe he had his senior students tutor the junior students, but what we have now is the terse lecture notes and translated into English. Nearly.
But were they not edited or at least compiled by Porphyry and a couple of other guys? Perhaps they came to this section, or also maybe it had been a lesson that they had been like, I have no idea what the hell he was talking about. Maybe it was, honestly, because they didn't do anything. He didn't add anything to it. He didn't or maybe he did. It hasn't been restructured or revised in any way that makes it any less difficult to understand.
Well, that's why in the Neoplatonic tradition, there's commentaries. Like we also have in the later centuries, Iamblichus and Syrianus, various other authors. So it becomes quite well developed later on, and we're just reading the first text of the major Neoplatonic tradition.
But
So,
how further do those guys go? And because I haven't read them, so I'm asking you. But as they go further and further into late antiquity and toward the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, how much of their glosses start to fall into, I don't know, like magical paranormal explanations that have no logical basis tied to anything that is observable in the real world, or perhaps even experiential? It's just like magical postulation. I don't know, maybe that's not the case, but I wonder if that makes it easier for them to start trying to come up with explanations for things.
well, this is a discussion effectively of like metaphysics. So it's not necessarily empirical, but it's starting from first premises, which is that there are these, forms in the intelligible realm, and then through
But he still needs to explain how he came to that deduction. It doesn't have to be through an empirical method. He still needs to, like, some sort of syllogism or some sort of logical walkthrough of how he came to this conclusion, which I don't see here.
I think it's just his conclusions. I mean, he doesn't explain them very clearly, but his ideas are effectively extensions that are elaborated out of necessity, because he has to explain how we get this perfect unity in the intelligible realm, and then the expression of that with varying qualities and distinctions, and various entities in the material realm which have very clear differentiated features to one another. And so he's explaining it based out of first premises, and then by extension, out of necessity, how do we get from that to this? That's my impression.
Okay.
I mean, unfortunately, there's no other data or any sort of explanation that he provides, and as the translators know, it is a challenging section.
So I keep on like bringing it up and then changing subject, but do you understand what these 5 genera are? Or what their function is?
Not immediately, no. I can't explain immediately.
Okay. I also noticed that like he does say that the qualities are not necessary attributes, that in some cases they are and in some cases they're not, such as the example of whiteness. Like in white paint, it's kind of necessary for the whiteness of the paint to be there. Otherwise, it's not white paint. It'll be paint, but it's not white paint. Whereas
you can't qualify the paint as white paint without the whiteness.
Whereas whiteness of a swan, if you take the whiteness away, it would still be a swan. So it seems that qualities can be, it depends on the circumstances. They can be accidental or necessary.
Right. And so that also explains the variability of perceived objects in the sensible realm.
And that these things really only exist, or the qualities really are only manifested in the sensible realm. Because in the intelligible realm, there's more of a wholeness to it. So something like, there is the form of white swan, there is the form of black swan, but when it emanates into this reality, let's say a swan can give birth to 4 different ducklings, which one of them is black and 3 of them are white.
Right. But the distinction between the color codes in relation to swans becomes different qualities that have to be explained as to how that sort of expression relates to the form of
right. Swan. I guess what I'm trying to say is, in the intelligible realm, it seems like these are separate, wholly unique things, like the form of, there's not like the form of swan, and then some of the form of swan can be black or white, because that would then have particulars. There's only the wholeness of black swan or white swan. But the way it emanates into this reality, and I made the example of one swan giving birth to, or laying eggs to multiple ducklings that are of different colors, was to kind of differentiate that here they are kind of particulars. They're not wholly unique, like a white, or like, I don't know, with cats, like a cat could give birth to kittens of different colors, even though perhaps in the intelligible realm, each possible variation of cat color and coat or whatever would be a wholly unique form, right? I guess I was just trying to clarify that is indeed the difference there between the form, the essence of a form, and the intelligible versus the qualities that its image may have here. And then, however, how the form gets to here, that part, I guess is what you are saying he is trying to explain, but in my mind, he has failed in explaining it. How that thing gets here.
Let's just look at it this way. So if you look at the example of the swans, how do we know? We know a swan is a swan when we see the swan, and we have the experience of seeing swans. But whether the swan is characterized or qualified as black or white, you still see a swan. And so the sort of form of the swan is expressed in a material manner, and then it can be qualified either as white or black. And so in this sense, it's epistemological in character, this whole process. It's not, strictly speaking, like an ontological expression. So it's not that you have the form like literally descending from another realm, but rather this sort of framework is attempting to explain how do we know things and distinguish things from one another at the sensible level, and then how is that operating or functioning in relation to the forms. So, and at the intelligible level.
I see. So he's not actually trying to explain that bridge in which in some way things actually emanate, just their relation to each other.
And how do we distinguish between them? That's the key part.
How do we distinguish between what?
So the forms, and how there are variable qualities that can qualify them or characterize them.
You mean that the identity of a thing? Because we can't really see we can't really identify the forms anyways here.
Well, that's why the qualities are unique expressions of the substance. So going back to this idea of a substance, so that's the essential nature of something, and it's the underlying nature, or
okay. So are you saying that his discussion is more about what the essential nature of a thing is, and then discerning what things are?
And how do we know them? And how do we know them? So, for example,
well, doesn't he believe, much like Plato, that? Well, I don't know. Has he gotten to that point? Maybe he hasn't. I guess we'll see. Does he believe that we have knowledge because of recollection, like Plato does?
That's a good question.
Because otherwise, how would we know? Because Plato makes the argument that Plato explains why he doesn't believe, or whoever, I forget which dialogue, whoever's talking doesn't, I guess Socrates, why it isn't us experiencing the images or the material, like illusion of these things in this world. It's not that we're learning it just because we're interacting with it, but because we're actually remembering it. We would recognize the essential nature of a thing, not because we're interacting with it here, because then we would perhaps think of each, accidental particular of different variations as the essentiality of it, but rather that we recognize pretty much immediately, according to them, the essential identity of a thing because we're recollecting from pre-life, I assume, in the intelligible realm, or somewhere maybe more pleasant than here, where we have full knowledge of these things, of the forms. I don't recall if Plotinus has actually come up and talked about that yet.
Using Plotinus's framework that we've read so far, I would suggest that since we're descended souls in matter, there would be another level where there is no individuated self, and that we're also part of that unity at the world soul and at the intelligible realm. And so from that point of view, I suppose you could say that there's a sort of potential for
our soul just knows.
Our soul knows, yeah.
Yeah.
And our soul is not like inherently decoupled from the world soul or the intelligible realm.
Yes, and that's why we recognize, I think that's probably what he would agree, that that's why we can recognize the essential identity of something.
Or we even have a conceptualization of things.
Right.
So, and for example, whether you have a black swan or a white swan, a big swan or a small swan, we still recognize the form of the swan.
Right.
And I mean, this could go into another direction where you talk about, neurological development and that sort of thing. But using Plotinus's framework, this is very much an epistemological process that he's attempting to explain.
Okay, I see. So he's not really answering, at this point anyways, the more juicy question, which is, how do things actually emanate into this real? I guess he did kind of talk about it in the other chapter where he talks about the difference between material in the sensible realm and material that is intelligible, and how descended soul or the image of different forms, I guess, enmesh. That's not even the right term probably, but how we perceive things at all that are also material, but not only here, versus that material which is not illuminated by the intelligible at all.
Right.
I guess he kind of gets into it a little bit there.
Because matter itself is without any sort of real substance. It's
Right.
deprived of any sort of substance, and it can only receive a form, and it's
Right.
only understood relative to the form that it has received.
So I guess that chapter gave more of an explanation to that question, whereas this is more of an epistemological explanation of the relation to each other, or how they relate.
Right, and this idea of matter being incorporeal is in 2.7, the subsequent section,
Yeah.
on complete blending. And so Plotinus says body must be matter and an inherent express principle, while the express principle itself must be seen as a bare form without matter. And if it is very much inseparable from matter, even if it is very much inseparable from matter, for the separable express principle is different, namely the one in the intellect, and it is in the intellect because it is in itself an intellect. That's the
that part I didn't understand. It is in itself. Could you repeat that?
So, and it is in intellect because it is in itself an intellect.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. So this is the express principle as
Right.
it is.
So this chapter that we're kind of going into, he basically presents the Stoics concept versus the Peripatetics concept of kind of, and then he explains his position on it, kind of, which has a sort of a metaphysical aspect to it too, but I feel like the Peripatetic and the Stoic concepts are a little bit more a matter of natural philosophy. They're talking about generally liquids, but I guess any matter, and whether or not things can truly be blended or be a true mixture. And the Peripatetics are of the mind that it isn't truly blended. It's more of a juxtaposition, almost like if you have, I don't know, water and oil. They just seem to be blended, but really they're just really, really close to each other. Mm-hmm. But they haven't actually, well, we'll get into like what actual chemistry is made probably too, but like they haven't actually exchanged any atoms or molecules or exchanged any, parts of themselves. They're just really close to each other and appear to be blended, but aren't. Whereas the Stoics believe that there is true blending. And he thinks some other stuff that he brings in metaphysical aspects, which
his statement,
I didn't really understand.
His statement is that for our position is that qualities go through bodies without making divisions. This is because they are incorporeal, and so bodies as as in material bodies are incorporeal because matter itself is not corporeal, and it is only determined by the reception of forms. So what he means then is that you can have various qualities, but that doesn't constitute an inherent division between material objects or material substances, because material substances themselves don't have any sort of absolute immutable quality to them. They're incorporeal. In this case, it's almost like a form of idealism, because matter is not of prime. It's not an ontological primacy. So
Well,
matter.
he's also not like really incorrect. Well, first, I want to say that he starts by presenting the two ideas and then kind of like veers off for a while and just focuses on what I would call like the porosity of things versus actually blending, because he keeps on making examples of like sweating through our skin or water going through papyrus or paper or whatever, which isn't quite the same thing as, isn't really related directly to the topic of two substances blending, because in those arguments the skin and or the papyrus aren't blending at all. It's just a matter of why he's like, why can they go through? Is it because there's some sort of porosity to it, or is it because the water or the sweat is actually dividing itself and being able to pass through it? So I thought that was kind of a tangent that didn't correlate precisely with the premise, but what he ends up thinking to be true, even though it's more metaphysical, I think there is some truth to it, even empirically, because he calls it matter, but fundamentally, yeah, matter molecules, they have no corporeality and they don't have an absolute form. You can rearrange atoms, really, however, as far as we know. So insofar as that's true, you can, have, well, we know that there are those molecules and those elements that can actually be blended, such as salt and water, because they are exchanging an atom. But then there's those which he doesn't talk about here. Maybe he'll get back to it later. But then there's those kinds of materials / molecules, elements that have a chemical reaction of, say, heating, or where something has to be released, right? Either through the form of an explosion of gas. I guess he'll get to that at some point. So my point is, like, even though he's talking about this metaphysically, ontologically, there is also some truth or some reflection of that in the material world, because he's not wrong to say that material is incorporeal and that it doesn't have a true form, because you can rearrange atoms and to some degree subatomic things to create other things. They're not fixed. Like,
So his position in here is effectively, it seems to just argue that matter is incorporeal, and that effectively arguing whether things blend or not at a physical level is inconsequential if you accept the premise that matter is incorporeal. So based on his framework, his metaphysics, it's kind of a unnecessary discussion to
well, it's kind of a cop out. He's trying to he's taking arguments of two other groups of people who are not trying to have the argument he was having. They were having more of a, it seems, I don't know, a purely empirical, not empirical, but an argument that was oriented toward natural philosophy, and he's trying to make it metaphysical.
straw man
So
argument.
maybe it's,
Straw man argument. He's arguing against people who are not really there to defend themselves.
Yes, but it's not just that. It's just like, it's a pointless argument. It's like making an argument about I don't know whether or not we're talking about chemistry, and then at the end of the day saying, well, they think that this is what's chemically happening, and this guy thinks this is actually what's chemically happening. None of it matters because we're all going to die. So it's like, okay, well, what kind of argument is that? I mean, it's a pretty short chapter, so maybe we're giving it much more time here than it actually may have had in his mind or in his lectures. Maybe it was just to, just another example of him reasserting what is important to focus on versus what is not important to focus on. But since well, at least me in reading it, I was really getting into the actual arguments everybody was making. And then his argument was, I'm like, okay, yes, this is true.
I think he was basically citing his opponents or the other school's way of thinking, just as giving some sort of background to it. It wasn't necessarily part of like a wider, coherent, structured thesis, but rather, I think if this was his lecture, then he was probably just like explaining how do the other schools, as we all know, for the people at the time, it would have been common knowledge. How do they understand these sort of things? And then what is my position?
Well, if you extract their position, all that's left is his position, which is basically this is irrelevant.
Right, and maybe that's the point of his short treatise here.
Perhaps, even though I do think that maybe unwittingly he also was saying something that was kind of accurate from in the sensible world, from a naturalistic point of view, about the incorporeality of material.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the peripatetics. Well, the other two guys. I'm still interested in what the other guys are saying. The argument where they're talking about how things don't take up the same space or don't end up having the same weight. That was a little confusing. I don't think it made much sense.
Like, yeah, water through papyrus. And
no. The other part where I think it's the Stoics who think that, or the question of, well, if you mix two things together, why is it still taking up the same space or something like that? And it's like, oh, because all the air's been sucked out, been displaced.
This actually brings to mind something in a Buddhist treatise that I'm translating now in the Abhidharma Kosha. And there's a debate whether matter can occupy the same space. And one of the examples that is argued against is like the reflection in a mirror. And so it begs the question of whether the reflection is occupying the same space as the surface itself. And there's an argument against that, but as far as perception goes, the reflection of the object on the mirror is functionally, visibly occupying the exact same space as the surface of the mirror itself.
Yeah, I mean, perceptually it is.
Perceptually it is.
But realistically it's not, which kind of brings us to the third chapter we talked about, because what they're perceiving is really just optics because of light, but it's light. It's not any matter. Even though it's not clear anymore what light is either. Like, I mean, scientifically, it's unclear to me if light is believed to have any sort of substantiality as matter, or if it's pure energy, or what the latest is on that, the nature of light, like in contemporary understanding. But and I bring up light because the next chapter is on basically his section on optics.
Yeah, so on seeing, or how it is that distant things appear small. Again, this is one of these short treatises, and then he explain, that size is only accidentally perceived along with the proper object of sight. Color is discussed at length and compared to the case of hearing.
So here he does at least entertain the topic at hand realistically. He doesn't just kind of write it off and say, oh, it's irrelevant. He does actually try to give an explanation, even though also he is wrong about some things, but he is unwittingly also correct about other things. And here too, he's he presents five different, I guess, positions that already existed at the time by different schools, or I don't know, other popular wisdom, of which he agrees, I guess, with number 4, which is the one he goes into most detail about. One of them, I'll kind of list off what some of the ideas are. So one was that things seem smaller because light gets contracted to fit one's sight and to fit the magnitude of the pupil. So I don't like, it sounds like whoever thought that actually believes that independent of our perception, light was actually was contracted, if I'm reading that correctly, which is wrong. Another one was that as distance between the pupil and objects and the object's matter, as distance between the pupil and the object's matter increases, the form arrives more isolated from matter, with the form, what did I write? The form and quality also being affected, such that even the quantity becomes form and quality, and only the rational content arrives. So that as you get further away from it, you're only perceiving still the actual form of it. And so only, like for humans, I guess only the blurry smallness of like the actual essentiality of the thing remains. I'm kind of surprised he doesn't like that idea. I don't know what I think about that one. Could be true, but not empirically. And then the third one is that we perceive magnitude through detailed survey of how long each portion is. It must be up close in order for its size to be known. He also disagrees with this. This is just one factor that isn't incorrect. It's not the totality of the reality of why in the sensible world we actually are able to see things, but things do need to be close enough to us for the mental processes that are actually happening neurologically to take place. And his idea, and I'll get back to that, and it's not his idea, but the one that he agrees with the most is number 4, which he gets into a little bit more. And then, as you mentioned, he starts talking or comparing it to hearing. He says, only accidentally is magnitude seen, since color is the primary object of vision. And he compares the size, he compares magnitude to loudness. And that magnitude becomes smaller, and the colors also become dimmer, though, as it gets further away. But it's really the color that's the main thing. Whereas, like, the size of the thing is only relevant insofar as, like how loud something is, or how loud something may appear to us, depending how far we are from it. So, first off, I don't think he's correct in thinking that the primary object of vision is color, because it's not. It's both rods and cones. If anything, it would be, I guess, he doesn't represent it as such, but the ability to take light in at all, to be able to see the magnitude or the shape of a thing, because there's people who are colorblind, but they can still see. But there aren't people who are incapable of taking in light and creating images who still, well, I guess there is. There's some people who still see color, but those people are essentially considered legally, if not totally, blind. And then the third one that he brings up, which he doesn't agree with, is basically Euclid's idea that smaller angles of sight, like that Euclid's idea that rays are leaving our eyes, if I remember correctly, and the smaller the angle of the thing, the smaller our perception of it. And he says, well, that doesn't make any sense, because why would that be the case? Because even though you see, that that car out in the distance really small. You can still see everything around it. But what he fails to bring up here is the fact that each thing you're seeing is related to the light that's shining upon that object specifically and also into your eye. So the amount of light shining on the car and its distance to your eye could still make it seem small. So the angle between your eye and that object is small enough that it does actually seem smaller to you, even though you're seeing, everything else around it. And I think of all this, Euclid, even though it was kind of inverse because he thought it was like rays leaving your eye when in rays of light or whatever he thought it was, he was kind of close though, geometric or like mathematically. It's really the light coming into your eye. But as far as his understanding of the geometry of it, it's pretty close to the truth. So I'm assuming that this chapter was added at this juncture because we've kind of talked about the relation between the forms and objects in the material world, then how material things seem to interact in the material world, even though he thinks it's irrelevant, insofar as the blending topic, which is basically chemists, like a very, very simplified and narrow discussion of chemistry. And here he's talking about the perception of things in the material world. But here I don't get the feeling that he really goes too much into metaphysics, even though the third argument, which is...
This doesn't seem to really touch on metaphysics. In fact,
no, the third argument does more than the one that he agrees with, because it brings up the forms. It's just like, I don't know whose argument it is. It's not the one that he prefers. But yeah. So I'm sure this was just notes to go with who knows what. But I thought it was kind of interesting, more from a more general philosophical point of view of looking at the tools that we use as philosophers through time to come to conclusions, and also how did some of these guys come to these partially correct, a lot of these hypotheses have aspects that aren't wrong, but I don't know if they were using some instruments to try to make, I guess Euclid was, doing calculations. But these other guys, whoever they are, Anaxagoras, I think, and Democritus, was this just logical deduction that they were, or just fully rationalistic ideas? I don't know. But it makes one think, if they came to these conclusions not through experimentation of any sort or through observation or very limited observation, and yet aspects of it are now verifiable through empirical evidence, those things always make me wonder if there's truth to Plato's idea of some innate knowledge or some innate remembering.
Well, here's a question then. Like if you are up close and you see the swan and you know it's a swan because it's up close to you, like maybe it's like a meter away from you and it's honking at you, it's a swan. But then if you see a swan on the other side of the lake, you might be able to identify it as a bird, but you might not know that it's a swan. And so then from like a metaphysical point of view, why is it that the magnitude of the swan has to be within a certain range for you to cognize it and recognize it?
Yeah.
And so
I don't know. I guess it depends to what level the materiality of our existence interferes.
Right. And so probably that would be the response to that question would be that there is obstacles and blockage so far as us being ensouled beings.
If I took out my contacts, I wouldn't even see the swan that's standing right next to me, to be honest. But I might still realize that he's a swan.
Well, you could also look at it this way too, is that even if you don't visibly see the swan, if your back is turned and you didn't notice the swan and it honks, then by virtue of the sound of the swan, you would cognize.
Right, but that's just using another one of your sense perceptions.
another one of your sense perceptions. I mean,
But
if
what
you
about those people? What about that sixth sense of like how people sometimes like how I mean, there is probably also a scientific or biological answer to this too, but that doesn't mean that it's not bonded with a metaphysical answer. The sensation when people like know that someone's watching them or can sense that someone is behind them, even if they haven't, heard anything or seen anything. I guess you could say there might be a shift in the pressure of the air or something like that that's imperceptible, but things like that where you kind of know a thing is without knowing it, or even the sense of danger of something. And I don't mean like obvious dangerous things like a person, like perceiving, even though their behavior may not be particularly off, just having a sensation of being in a dangerous situation.
Well,
Like a gut sense.
Rupert Sheldrake, who has been criticized and driven out of the academy, has this idea that we can often know ahead of time when somebody is calling us. And it's not because this person calls at a specific time regularly, but they've done these experiments where they will get somebody to randomly call you who you know, and before you answer the phone, you're supposed to guess who called you. And then the statistical probability of you getting it right versus how often you get it right, there's an indication that there seems to be foreknowledge of knowing when somebody's calling you. And he's also done experiments where pets have been documented knowing when their owners are coming home. And it's not because it's a fixed time, like I'm coming home after work at 5:30. But what they've done is installed cameras in the house, and they watch the dog or the cat. And
Well, how close is the owner to actually entering the house?
well, that's the thing, is that they get them to start driving home, but far away enough that the animal wouldn't be able to hear a familiar
Right.
sound
It's like
car.
still it's still like more than half a block away or whatever.
And then they'll try to trick the experiment by calling them on the phone and saying, like, now turn around and go somewhere else, and then trying to test the animal's reaction. And what they've discovered is that quite often animals know when their owners are coming home.
That's interesting. I've had my own experience. Oh, so go ahead.
And so Rupert Sheldrake is one of these researchers who has argued for the reality of psychic phenomena and trying to illustrate it either through looking at people's foreknowledge of somebody calling them or pets knowing when their owners are coming home.
Yeah. I found myself more times than not, especially with people I'm particularly close to, or like specific friends, and I don't even know if this is really the same thing or could be the same kind of thing you're talking about, but where I will pick up my phone to text them at the exact same time, and I don't know they're going to do it, and it's not like there's some specific time that we usually text each other, it's just random. I pick up my phone to text them, and at that precise moment, they have also picked up their phone to text me, even if it's about completely different topics, like not that we're texting each other about the same thing. But this happens a lot to me.
Yeah, and so Rupert Sheldrake's experiments have also documented this, knowing when somebody's going to phone you before they call you as well.
Yeah.
Having a sense.
And these are people in different time zones. It's not like we're, like we both, and it's also like all over the place. It's not just every time, like after say 5 o'clock, we both get off work or whatever, because we're also in different time zones. It's completely different schedules, completely erratic. It's not tied to seemingly anything. And it happens at different times. And it doesn't happen like with the same with any sort of regularity or you know what I mean? Like not with a specific regularity.
Right. And so that's the evidence. Like we have anecdotal evidence, if you're at least, open to the idea that these sort of, so-called psychic phenomena actually do occur. And
but I guess it also begs the question, though, and even of his experiments, and also what I've just described, that happens maybe quite often, but what about all the times that that does not happen? How many times were these people about to be called and they had no presentiment of it?
Right. And I mean, that's the big question of like, well, why does it
Yeah.
happen sometimes but not other times? And
It could be coincidence.
could be coincidental. But then they've tried to test this and try to demonstrate the statistical probability of you getting it right randomly versus how often you get it right. But I think anecdotally too, I mean, I've had the experience many, many times. I mean, where I sense like I'm going to see somebody and then I see them on the street and I haven't seen them yet. Like maybe they're coming from like around the corner and there's been no visual sighting of them. And sure enough, I run into them. And some people have even told me, it's like, I had a feeling I was going to run into you. And it's interesting when that happens. And I think a lot of people who are not necessarily dedicated to a materialist point of view are open to the idea. But the problem is that reproducing it under laboratory conditions or in a way that
Right.
would satisfy the modern scientific institution would be challenging, if not impossible. And then
Right.
another issue is that within the realm of materialism, it's basically not permissible that psychic phenomena can exist. It cannot and should not exist. So it's unlikely.
Well, even if that may not even be the case, but it's more that there's the expectation that things must adhere to the rules of things in the material realm, since we're calling it that. But they want to use rules on things that we don't even have, if they exist, don't adhere to the laws of physics of the material world. Potentially, probably. Therefore, it's kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It's a rigged game, because that is not the way that you're going to be able to verify whether or not this exists. It's like trying to play chess with the rules of checkers or something and expect the outcome to be a game that makes any sense.
Right. But in our present day, as we both know, what is considered to be true knowledge tends to be determined by what logical positivism and materialism indicate is possible and real. I mean, if you lived 2,000 years ago, then you would have a much more diverse amount of worldviews, Aristotelian, Platonic, Stoic, various systems of physics that were debated with they all debated with one another. But
right, that were. I mean, there are different worldviews now. They're just not the ones that are the status quo. There are very few that are allowed. Let's say that are not allowed, but that are officially recognized by society as valid.
Well, yeah, officially sanctioned.
But there's systems of knowledge, the powers of the systems that control what is considered truth and knowledge and what is not.
Right. I mean, that's a whole other big question. I mean, if you're looking at the history of philosophy and religion and so on, you can very easily see how at one point in European civilization, there was, a predominant Christian worldview that was basically the mainstream, and then the others, even if they weren't necessarily like, ripped out at the root, they weren't endorsed by the state and the aristocracy. And then today it's changed. So now that we have like logical positivism and materialism as the main worldviews of our day, and you can still have, Platonic metaphysics or Buddhist ontology, but they're not endorsed by the state. And the research funding goes to a certain area. And I mean, that's just the age that
that's also like the secular is, not that I'm saying it's an incorrect thing, but that started the moment that the concept of the modern state was deemed something that should be secularized.
Well, even the idea,
if you think about it.
Well, it's even the idea, why does secular have to be materialist? Why couldn't you have a Platonic secular state? And
because the concept of secular is one in which there is no belief system that is not dependent on empirical evidence.
On empiricism, right? But then,
yes, because that is considered the only "quote unquote" neutral verdict on things. That is fact based, but
and
I mean, we could argue. We could go on about this all day. people who see things that way and people who see things other ways. It's not even that I don't think that empiricism doesn't have a role. It certainly does. I bring it up all the time, almost to, in some ways, to validate some of the arguments that this guy makes, because there's those people who think that only the immaterial is valid, and there's those people who think that only the material is valid. I'm of the thought that both things exist and have a role in different realms and for different things.
Right. I'm in agreement. I mean, I don't obviously deny matter, but at the same time, too, I recognize that there's a lot of things which have even material efficacy, which are not material. Like, for example, if I say certain words to you in a certain context, I can solicit, a physical response in your heart rate. For example, if I say something cruel or sad or threatening, it could trigger something in your heart rate. It could elevate.
Well, that fundamentally goes to theories of philosophy of language and interpretation of what systems and signs mean, and like how we interpret that chemically, hormonally, neurologically. But you could also add to that, if you wanted to, that there's some fundamental aspect there that also ties back to consciousness, and then that will bring into the material world of questioning something that may be beyond the material that they can't quite pinpoint. And we talked about that last time, I believe, a little bit.
Well, my point is that language itself is immaterial, but it does have, it can, through the sort of intermediary of a human organism with a functioning brain, have a material impact. It can have an influence on material processes.
But that depends if you think that words, material words are actually independent of the meanings that we assign to them or not.
That's my point, is that you have like this intermediate stage where you have something like language and words, which are not, you can't identify a material foundation for a word, and a word can be expressed verbally, it can be expressed with sign language, it can be expressed with script, like writing on paper or on a screen. But the actual word itself, the actual words we actually use, are not material. But then there's this intermediary, almost like membrane that you go through, and then those words can have an effect on material processes, particularly biological processes. And this can even be affected with, like, for example, a dog. Like, for example, a dog knows its name, and if you start shouting its name in the middle of an afternoon nap, it will increase heart rate and come to see. Whereas if you're maybe saying something other than its name, then it won't have the same physical response. And that just begs the question, is like, how is it that you have immaterial words affecting an organism?
It's also interesting that generally the kind of words that have such an effect on us are not, the word itself is immaterial, but there's words that are immaterial. There are immaterial, all words are immaterial, but what they're signifying can be either something material or something immaterial as well, such as the word table. It signifies something that is materially here, that I have my laptop on, but I could say something such as love or corporation, which are kind of both in very different ways immaterial things, which you could try to describe by aspects and activities are associated with it, but are fundamentally immaterial things. And it's interesting that in general, with I think a few exceptions tied very closely to like fear around survival, that most of the kinds of terms, most of the words that will elicit the strongest reactions in people are words that are generally signals of other immaterial concepts, not of material things.
Right. And
generally.
And symbols can have the same function. So on Valentine's Day,
I mean, symbols are language as well. I mean, if we speak, I think in general, what we're really, you and I are talking about right now is language broadly, which can be words. It can be, it's any kind of symbol for the purpose of communication.
Right. And just as an example of powerful symbols, like on Valentine's Day, if your loved one sends you a Valentine's with, a heart-shaped box with sweets inside, everybody in the Western world understands that the heart signifies love, the shape of the heart, even though it's completely arbitrary and it doesn't have really any sort of inherent meaning to it. Whereas if your lover sends you, I don't know, something like a bunch of chicken bones, unless there's some sort of comic reference involved in this, it would have a very different effect from a heart-shaped box of chocolates.
That's
Right.
because we're a society that's built on symbols. I guess maybe what you're trying to get at is that even though we're material, we live in the material world, we're embodied souls, and all of these symbols may be images of, I don't know if this is where you're going, but that's where I'm going. They are snippets of images of the form. And at the end of the day, as humans, the things that beyond our bodily needs for survival, everything else, both vice and virtue, that we're so interested in are quite immaterial.
Right, right. But there's this membrane, as I would describe it, between immaterial entities that obviously have an effect on our biology and then the material world. And there's a sort of
Are you
membrane.
trying to signify that this membrane is something specific?
The membrane seems to be the organism, where you have, for
Oh,
example,
us.
immaterial words, and then the immaterial words are processed through us, and then
Right.
it's through our biology, our physiology, that you have the
So we have a reaction.
material effect. So me yelling at a rock and saying foul, threatening
You don't
words
know
to it,
that. You don't know that.
unless panpsychism is completely true and the rock is fully aware of what I'm saying. But the point is that, like, if some person on the street is saying threatening language to you, that has a different effect on your physiology than someone saying, like, have a very nice day,
Yes.
right? And then, but
Yes.
I've always kind of contemplated, like, well, so the actual immaterial symbolism of language, if we can even call, like, words things, still has a very discernible effect on our physiology.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
Yeah, and so by virtue of that, I would say, like, well, how could you say that immaterial things don't exist and have, like, some sort of causal efficacy in material reality? I think it goes back and forth, but so to be a firm materialist that suggests that everything can be deduced to material processes, I think, is a challenging position to defend in light of that.
Well, I mean, this is like linguistics is what you're talking about. Modern linguistics theories.
Right, but it just comes down to the question is, like, if everything is deduced to matter, then what exactly are these immaterial processes that have a discernible effect on material phenomena? So anyways, this is a discussion perhaps for another time, and
Yeah.
we can conclude things here. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.